Yellow Dog of the Crow Apsaluk people was photographed by F.J. Haynes and Bro in 1889 during the transition period from the plains to the reservations. The image circulated as both an ethnographic record and a portrait of indigenous leaders, integrating Haynes's commercial series on the peoples of the Great Plains in the northern United States. In 1898, Frank A. Reinhardt portrayed Lucy Red Cloud, a Sioux woman, in the series made at the Indian Congress of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, created to document Native American delegations. The image presents Lakota clothing, adornments, and ceremonial posture, preserving the memory of their leaders and families. In 1892, in Montana, Bird Wild Hog, also known as Hedgehog and Snake Whistle, posed for a portrait marking the twilight of the Indian Wars. As reservations and assimilation policies were imposed, soldier photographer Christian Barthelmess documented the Cheyenne and the daily life of garrisons on the plains. Montana, early 20th century. In the Blackfeet camp, tippahs form a circle while horses graze. The organization sustained mobility and exchange. The image, captured by Walter McClintock on a magic lantern slide, records routines and reveals the group's adaptation to reservation rules and market pressures around 1905. If you love the Wild West and enjoy vintage pinup portraits, I've left a bonus for you in the pinned comment: a pack with 50 vintage cowgirl posters available for a limited time. Portrait of the Apsaluk group, early 20th century, in the Montana region, possibly on the Crow Reservation. Recorded by N.A. Forsyth, the scene reveals clothing, mounts, and social arrangements in a period between 1900 and 1915, marked by the action of federal agencies and assimilation schools. The photograph circulated in postcards and regional collections. The Parting, 1908, a photo by Roland W. Reed, portrays Ojibwe members in a farewell at the beginning of the 20th century. Made in the Great Lakes region, it combines record and staging, a hallmark of the author. By fixing clothing, canoes, and ritual gestures, the work highlights the tension between indigenous practices and assimilation policies in the United States during a period of change. Montana, early 20th century. Blackfeet women pose for N.A. Forsyth amid the consolidation of reservations and assimilation policies. Their clothing mixes traditional pieces with trade items. The portrait reveals the female role in the economy, rituals, and knowledge transmission during the transition to reservation life. Record of the first gun club in La Junta, Colorado, around 1900. The group brought together residents and railroad workers for shooting practice, open-season hunting, and local tournaments. In the West, such activities were routine. The club also functioned as a space for male sociability and civic discipline, with widely publicized safety rules. In the early 20th century in Montana, a story called A Ride in the White Man's Stink Wagon narrates the first encounter between indigenous peoples and settlers with the gasoline automobile, the stink wagon. The story, present in newspapers and local memoirs, reveals curiosity, caution, and the rapid presence of the machine on Montana's rural routes. Ki-ya-tadi, also called Loti or Lota-Atsi, appears in a record from the Pueblo of Laguna in what was then the New Mexico Territory, around 1904. The note gathers Anglophone spellings of the indigenous name and, perhaps linked to a photo or ethnographic study, places the person in the Laguna community in the early 20th century, highlighting the crossing of records. In 1899, the Hain Photo Studio recorded Left Hand Bear of the Oglala Lakota. These late 19th century portraits emerged after the wars and the fixing of reservations and served as visual evidence of identities subjected to federal policies. Circulating in albums and exhibitions, they shaped the public's view of indigenous peoples. In 1901, Buffalo Bill posed alongside Pawnee and Lakota artists and chiefs at Colonel Fred Cummins' Indian Congress during the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, USA. In the row, from left to right, Brave Chief, Eagle Chief, Knife Chief, Young Chief, Buffalo Bill, American Horse, Rocky Bear, Flies Above, and Long Wolf. In 1883, Ben Whittick recorded at the Summer Garden in Santa Fe a dance hall that spoke volumes about life on the frontier. There, merchants, workers, and soldiers mingled in open dances, driven by bands, in a seasonal pavilion that transformed leisure into encounter and the square into a stage in what was then the New Mexico Territory. In 1905, Edward S. Curtis recorded Lakota and Dakota leaders in ritual attire, showing signs of status and alliances. The portrait is part of his attempt to document the indigenous peoples of North America and took place after the Plains Wars, when federal pressure for assimilation and land loss was intensifying. Innocence, a Umatilla Girl, 1910. Portrait by Edward S. Curtis in The North American Indian, made at the height of U.S. assimilation policies. The image documents lifeways of the Northwest and refers to the Columbia Plateau, home of the Confederated Tribes. The pose and clothing, directed by Curtis, suggest a more ethnographic than spontaneous gaze. In 1905, at the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana, Antoine Moise, called Grizzly Door, and Michael posed for a photograph recording indigenous presence while the government consolidated policies over tribal lands. The portrait highlights clothing and identities during a period of change for the Salish and Kootenai peoples. Around 1900, H.S. Poley recorded the Garden of the Gods in Colorado, near Colorado Springs. The sandstone formations in Ute territory were already attracting visitors and scholars by the end of the 19th century. The probable glass plate negative reflects the era when tourism and railroads advanced through the Front Range and redrew travel maps. Between 1870 and 1890, C.M. Bell recorded in studio Little Wound, an Oglala Sioux chief. The portrait shows a negotiator active with United States authorities after the Sioux Wars in ceremonial attire. The image is part of an ethnographic collection from the late 19th century and preserves the presence of a leader who moved between tradition and politics. Tutuk Apichis of the Pawnee Nation also appears in the records as Gives to the Poor and Prairie Chicken. In 1868, he served as a tribal policeman and scout contracted by the United States Army on the Central Plains amid the conflicts of the period. His nicknames appear in ethnographic records, portrayed by William Henry Jackson in 1868. Portrayed between 1880 and 1900, a Ute man of the Rocky Mountains people lived through the phase of reservation consolidation and the pressure for assimilation. He lived in areas that today form Colorado and Utah. The portrait highlights clothing and adornments that unite tradition and trade goods, revealing continuous adaptation and cultural persistence without losing memory. A Hopi hairstyling specialist is portrayed moments before beginning his craft. The photo, taken by Charles A. Nast between 1890 and 1910, is part of a collection marking the passage between the 19th and 20th centuries and recording work practices in the pueblos of the U.S. Southwest, a region that today corresponds to the state of Arizona and their ways of making. Between 1920 and 1930, a photograph shows Martha Waugh Pear of the Comanche people, with her son, George Washington, strapped to a cradle board, a traditional cradle used to transport and protect babies. The portrait records practices of care and mobility among the Comanche. The support kept the child secure. George was born on July 4th. In 1864, the portrait of Seth Kinman, a California hunter, crystallized the frontier. Leather on his body, weapon in hand, and trophies in sight, he embodied the mountain man. Amid the Civil War and westward expansion, life in Humboldt County appeared tied to hunting, which supplied settlements with skins and meat in a cycle of trade and survival. In the midst of winter, a medicine lodge rises on the Great Plains. In front of the structure stand Siksika, Blackfoot men, gathered in community routine. The scene was photographed in 1912 by Roland Reed, a period of increasing state control over rituals, and today serves as a key record for Siksika cultural history and collective memory. In 1898, in Boulder County, men pose on and inside a horse-drawn stagecoach. The scene shows the daily use of animal traction at the end of the 19th century, when the city established trade and mail routes between regional mines and the urban centers of the Front Range. In the late 1890s, Jesse H. Bratley photographed Harry with Horns, a Lakota boy, at the Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota. The portrait captures Indigenous youth in a phase of recomposition, when the Plains nations dealt with federal policies of assimilation and land control after the 19th century wars. The shot marks a historical turning point. In 1905, Geronimo Chiricahua Apache chief and prisoner of war at Fort Sill since 1894, went to Washington to parade at Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration, under surveillance. There, he asked permission to return to Arizona and was denied. In the same year, he dictated his life to S.M. Barrett. The account was published in 1906. He remained detained in Oklahoma, far from his land. Charging Bear, Mato Watakpe, a member of the Western Dakota Sioux, was recorded in Yankton in March 1905. The period annotation identifies the person and his community, situating him on the reservation at the beginning of the 20th century, when administrative surveys and photographs sought to catalog leaders and families. In 1912, in Montana, in what is now U.S. territory, a Piegan-Piikani couple of the Blackfeet Confederacy pose in front of a teepee on the edge of a cliff overlooking a river. The scene, recorded as a document, was photographed by Roland W. Reed and later hand-colored with Johannes Anderson, an example of ethnographic practices of the early 20th century. In 1893, a Ute mother and her son pose for J.A. Boston. The scene shows the family adapting to reservations in Colorado and Utah in the West. The framing highlights clothing for daily use and trade objects, material that allows investigation of life patterns and the relationships between photographers and Indigenous communities at the end of the 19th century.